None of us has life in ourselves, and none becomes our own master when we die. For if we have life, we are alive in the Lord, and if we die in the Lord. And so then, whether we live or die, we are the Lord's possession. In the time before I was ordained, when I was just thinking about what the pastoral ministry was going to be like and so forth, I remember thinking that probably the hardest thing that I'd have to deal with would be dealing with death, with people who are dying and the fact of death. And I think that was kind of a natural thought, but I also realized that part of why I was thinking in those terms was that in the family that I grew up in, we didn't talk about death. We didn't do death. There were some underlying reasons for that. But that is the way it was. And actually, I'd never seen anybody die. And in fact, I'd never seen the body of anybody who had died. Except for once, when I went to a wake, having no idea in my head that at a wake, I would probably see the body of somebody who has died. Because we just never talked about that. We never experienced anything like that. When my father died, I was 14. And actually, I was the only member of the family who went to the funeral. My siblings were younger than I and were considered to be too young to go. And my mother just didn't go to funerals. So I just announced that I was going, and so I did. It was a graveside service, and so it was relatively short, and we gathered around the grave and so forth. And actually, when it was over, since I was the only member of the family there, I was the receiving line. And everybody kind of lined up, to speak to me, and that was fine. And it went on until the priest kind of figured it was time for him to get me out of there. And so he came along and took me away and took care of me. So anyway, as I was saying, I used to think that dealing in that arena was going to be really tough. Shortly after I was ordained, and I was working in a parish, one morning I got a call from our parish priest, who was the rector, I was the curate. And he said that he had gotten a call that morning from somebody in a neighboring parish. Their rector was away. He was out of the country, actually. But this person had told the priest in our church that actually they had had a very sad incident in their parish. And a child had tragically died. And they were hoping that somebody from our parish, mainly our priest, would be able to come and visit the family. And the priest said to me, and my rector said to me, unfortunately, I have to be away this morning. could you possibly make that call? I took a deep breath. I had a lump in my throat. And I said, of course. So when I get to the porch of this family, I stood on the porch, and I think I was shaking from head to toe. I was asking myself, what am I going to say? What if they ask me, why did God allow this to happen? What if they start blaming themselves for what happened? What am I supposed to say about that? So before I push the bell, I decided I better pray. And I had a 3-word prayer. I need help. Well, I rang the doorbell, and the family let me in. They couldn't have been more welcoming or gracious. Their basic message was, thank you for coming. It means so much to us that you could come. And we sat and we talked quietly. Some of the time we just sat, so we were just being silent. There were moments when we shed tears together. And after a while, we made preliminary plans for what was going to happen next with the funeral and so forth. And I began to realize that my role there, my role was not so much to say or do anything. It was mainly to be there and to care and to quietly pray with them. And personally to pray that if there were any way that I could be an instrument to help them to adjust to this unbearable new reality in their lives, a reality that they're never going to really get over. And if there were some way in which I could help them find ways to weave their lives back together, that's what I would like to do. Well, thinking back on all of that, I treasure my time with that family. I treasure that morning. And I realized it was an honor. It was an honor to have been invited to be with them at this supremely intimate time, agonizing as it was. Sometimes being at the bedside of somebody who's dying can be actually quite upbeat. And there can even sometimes be some humor in it. I remember a lady who lived not too far from here some years ago. She was dying and actually was in a nursing home. And she had asked that I would bring her communion, which of course I was happy to do. I went into the nursing home, and I was, we had an incredibly nice visit. We spoke very openly with one another. She was fully aware of what was happening. And we went over our relationship over the years and all of that. It was a very warm and loving conversation. And all the time, all through it, a nurse kept coming in, because the nurse had to check on this or that, and she was a fine nurse. But whenever she came in, she would always speak to this lady, and she would always refer to her as dearie. Now, this lady was quite a dignified person, and quite a sophisticated person. She'd lived all around the world, and she was a bit formidable. And she was not somebody that you would refer to as dearie. It just wasn't. And every time the nurse was saying that, I was going a little bit like mad. But anyway, we had this wonderful visit together. And I'm so grateful that we were able to have it. And when it was over, we hugged. And we said goodbye to one another, because we knew that things were coming to a close quite quickly. And then I looked at her and I said, maybe there's one other thing that I can do for you. She said, what's that? I said, I can deal with this dearie question. She smiled and looked at me and she said, John, I've only got about a day left. I think I can handle it. And then some years later, there was a lady who was 103 years old. I had met her 3 years before. I was new in that congregation, and she was on the list, and she was housebound. And I went to her house so that I could meet her and we could develop a relationship. And we had a very, very nice talk. She was a very nice person, a very lively person, really. And at the end of our conversation, as I was getting ready to leave, she said, I hope you'll come and see me again. She said, I know I'm going to live at least until November. I said to her, how do you know that? And she said, well, in November I'm going to be 100, and I know of at least 3 surprise parties. And actually, it turned out to be 4 because we got her to church that day, and we got a big balloon to attach to her wheelchair, and we had a birthday cake and did the whole thing there as well. I found over the years that sitting in a deathbed with somebody who is awaiting the time when they're going to die, maybe holding their hand, maybe praying with them if they're conscious, and praying anyway, even if they're not conscious. It can seem like a very long time, because sometimes it is a very long time. In fact, a lot of the time, it can seem like it's forever. And it can be painful, because you know that the person that you're sitting with often is in pain. And you're watching their body struggling to stay alive. Our bodies seem to be designed to try to, be alive, to survive. And that stands us in pretty good stead most of the time. but it can be very painful at the end. Well, the person dies, and somehow that's a very different moment. And for a long time, I tried to think, how would I describe that time after the person has died? And I finally came up with this thought, that it's like all of a sudden the room is just filled with angels. Now, I had a relative. She was a relative by marriage, and she was married. Her first husband was my uncle, but I'd known her all my life. And she had been quite instrumental in the course of my life, even after she was divorced from her first husband. And through all the years of my life, it was very clear, she had made it very clear, that she wanted nothing to do with religion. Nothing. And as she was coming to the end of her life, she was making it over and over, she was making it very clear that there was to be no funeral. And there were to be no prayers, or as she articulated it, mumbo jumbo. She was clear about that, and I was definitely prepared to honor her wishes. I always want to honor those kinds of wishes. So on the day that she was dying, I went in to stay with her. She was not conscious, but I held her hand and talked to her and did my best to assure her that I was there. And I was there for a very long time, 12 or 13 hours. And fortunately, I had enough experience to know that I should bring some snacks with me. But anyway, it was a long vigil. And when she died, it was about 3 in the morning. And she died, and I was standing at her bedside at that point, and I thought, well, I think I'm allowed to say my own prayers. I was standing there and quietly praying. My eyes were closed. After a while, I opened my eyes and I saw on the other side of the bed a wonderful nighttime nurse. She was just great all the way through. And she was standing on the other side of the bed, and I realized that what she was doing the same thing I was doing. She was praying. And I just smiled and I thought to myself, this is just right. This is just good. So I closed my eyes again, and I was just meditating and praying alone. And suddenly I heard a voice, loud and clear, from the other side of the bed. And it went like this: "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee." And I thought, I tried to honor what she wanted. And this is the way it went. Most of us, I think, have been conditioned all through our lives to think of heaven as a reward for good behavior. And I wonder about that. More and more, I wonder about that. I wonder if our thinking that way isn't an indication of a human control issue. That what we're trying to say when we say something like that is that the bounty of God depends on us, on how we are, what we do, instead of depending on the boundless love of God. The person who has died is a child of God. And more, I think that it's not for us to be calling the shots for our mutual, loving, almighty parent. It's time for us to let go and let God. And to trust that God is love and that God knows what God is doing. So meanwhile, for us who are still here, there is the message from today's gospel in which Jesus says, I give you a new commandment, that you should love one another as I love you. Now we might well reply to that. This isn't a new commandment. Jesus is always saying that. But when we hear this gospel, I think we're meant to hear it, to receive it in the sense that Jesus is saying, do it anew. Do it in new ways. Think about new ways that you can do it. Love one another as you have never done before. Do it every day, day after day, until the moment you come to your dying. In every culture, each culture has its own way of honoring those who have died, of releasing their departed ones in their way, of praying for them. And I believe that each way is to be honored. Each way is to be respected. The Christian way, the Episcopal version of the Christian way, involves this. This prayer that is meant to be said at the time when somebody dies. Depart, O Christian soul, out of the world. In the name of God, the Father Almighty, who created you. In the name of Jesus Christ, who redeemed you. In the name of the Holy Spirit, who sanctifies you. May your rest be this day in peace, and your dwelling place in the paradise of God. Amen.